everyone, and welcome to Art of Citizenry podcast, where we navigate the complexities of doing good in an unequal world. I am your host and in-house educator, Manpreet Kaur Kalra. From saviorism to poverty porn, for decades, storytelling has become part and parcel of marketing and fundraising efforts. For social enterprises, stories about the lives of the artisans who design and create products are shared often in the name of transparency. With storytelling a core part of many brands' marketing strategy, the conversation around consent is often overlooked. During this episode, we will explore what it means to seek informed consent before sharing photos and stories of artisans while critically looking at the power dynamics that often shape the stories themselves. The biggest strength and failure of a social entrepreneur is storytelling. Where light otherwise remains unshone, social entrepreneurs share stories of hardship, poverty, and inequality. As an unintended consequence, these stories often further deep-seated racial power dynamics first introduced with colonialism. I am joined by Joy McBrien, the founder and CEO of Anita, a fair trade social enterprise that strives to build a more inclusive economy for women. Anita employs 8,000 women across 9 different countries to create fashion accessories ranging from jewelry to handbags. Their vision is to design a world in which women and girls can grow up feeling safe, respected, and valued, no matter their geography. Joy, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to have you here on the podcast. To start, I would love for you to share with our listeners a little bit about yourself and your journey.
Yeah. So as you were saying, Anita, we're a social enterprise. We partner with 8,000 super talented women around the world, creating fair trade jewelry and accessories. We're named after a social worker in Chimbote, Peru, Chimbote being one of the largest, poorest cities in the world. I had the very real privilege of living and working beside Anita, our namesake, who is a social worker in the community. And she taught me so much about what economic development looks like on the ground and how women can be real change makers, especially when given those economic opportunities. So Anita is one of my favorite humans in the entire world. She is just completely adored by her community. She is known by everyone. She is a very fair and empathetic human and kind of leader I aspire to be. Over the years, I've just learned a lot about the power of agency and how that can really positively affect your mental health. And so after I had first experienced rape and sexual violence as a young person, I was struggling to connect with anyone, and I wasn't talking about it, but I was doing a lot of research. I had a lot of internal struggles and wanted to work more on violence against women. I learned that Peru had, at least at the time, had the highest reported rate of domestic violence in the world. At 70% of women were reporting experiencing domestic violence. And so as kind of an independent study at University of Minnesota, I decided that I wanted to live and work in Peru for a while, and worked alongside a group of incredibly talented local women in Chimbote, Peru that were building a battered women's shelter. So together we built a battered women's shelter, and it was through that I met Anita, who's a social worker. And then we formed this friendship. She now considers me her her daughter. I've been in all of her other daughters' weddings. And I ended up living with her too. So she became my host mom. And then over the years, I usually go back about once a year and spend time with her and her family. That's kind of why I started in Peru working on this, and then eventually led to the social enterprise that we run now, Fair Anita. And it's all really been centered around that idea of agency and around the idea of having the agency to determine what your own identities are too. So women being that of change makers and job creators and nurturers and all these wonderful things, not just being known as a victim or kind of powerless in that way. It's been interesting to see how people self-identify, how that changes as they develop this agency in different ways.
As you know, I strongly believe language has the power to break and also reinforce stereotypes. I found it interesting to hear you say the word agency versus empowerment. Empowerment is a really loaded word, and one I see often used by social enterprises to describe the impact of their work on the artisans they work with. Personally, I find the word empowerment quite problematic because it reinforces the idea that the person on the other end or the receiving end has no power to begin with, essentially discounting any form of agency. How do you navigate language in your business?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting contrast, and it's one that I've definitely been grappling with over the years. Our first tagline actually with Fair Anita was designed to empower. And that was actually given to us by a local newspaper here. They were the first to write about our mission and made it, they were kind of like our coming out as a brand. And that was their title, was designed to empower. And I just loved it. So we kept it. And over the years, as I've actually thought about it, I'm like, ooh, I don't like that actually at all. And so it's been a process of going back and like trying to change it. When I think about empowerment, especially as a white woman who's running a fair trade organization, and what does it mean myself as a white woman working with almost exclusively women of color, what am I then saying with that word? Because ultimately the word empowerment, right, means to give power. And I don't really feel like that's what it is. I think there's a mutual giving of power. Like there's power in our combined relationship, our shared experiences, but I don't feel like it's one-sided as the word empower suggests.
I personally believe the social enterprises need to recognize and internalize that their relationship with the artisans, makers, craftspeople, farmers, and whatnot that they work with is mutually beneficial. Without them, you would have no business. This understanding of relationships being one-sided lead to problematic marketing that's rooted in saviorism, furthering colonialist power dynamics between the global North and global South. In the social impact space, we especially see this come out in the form of storytelling. Often the narratives we share about makers on swing tags and blog posts on social media are really intimate and can even possibly put the maker at harm if people within their community read or hear that story. This is why I think informed consent is so important. Before you share a story about a maker, they need to understand the magnitude in which it will be shared and possibly the repercussions. Can you talk about how you practice this with Fair Anita?
I built relationships with the artisans that we currently work with about 5 years before I actually started Fair Anita. So a lot of these women, I know them really well. And I know a lot of aspects about their lives and their personal histories and their traumas. It's something that we've shared as we've built our relationship. And that's been a topic of conversation as I share my own histories, they share theirs. And it's been kind of a strange levelizer in some ways. I think, especially given the inevitable power dynamics that are at play when myself as a white woman with an American passport, is in a community that ultimately isn't mine, and all the things that brings along with it. talking about this shared human experience that we have a lot of times with sexual violence. It's been pretty strange, but also beautiful, I think, to be able to really deeply connect over this intimate human trauma. That being said, I know a lot about these women, and they've shared things with me ultimately in confidence, And I think when we're talking about storytelling, a lot of times customers especially are, they want to know the stories. They want to know who made their products. And I think that's fantastic. I think that's what we need to be asking brands more of. But by no means is anyone entitled to those stories. So, when we work with artisans, historically, what our consent look like in terms of storytelling when we were talking to our artisan partners, we just basically say, is there anything you want our customers to know about you? And 9 times out of 10, they say, we are very grateful they're buying our products and thank you for, liking the earrings that we sell. Ultimately, when you're proud of your work, that makes sense. Most people aren't asked to share their traumas and their histories, in their workplace. It's not an expectation, nor should it be. So we're just thinking a lot more about how should we be telling these stories? Should we be telling the stories? What does that best look like?
Yes, I really like your point on understanding the power we hold as outsiders. It's not uncommon to hear people say that because they live in the country they are producing in, they are somehow immune to any problematic storytelling or behavior. But what we fail to acknowledge is the privilege we hold as outsiders. If things don't work out, we have something we can fall back on. Our passports allow us to easily leave if we want to. That isn't necessarily the case for those living in the communities many social enterprises operate in. Another thing you mentioned that I think is important to touch on is fashion revolution. While I believe the fashion revolution movement has been such a powerful force in getting consumers to ask questions about supply chains and buy more thoughtfully, I feel it has also pushed brands to share more artisan stories. Why is knowing the maker's name not good enough? Why is it that instead of sharing professional bios like most companies do of their employees, brands choose to share intimate details about the personal lives and trauma of makers? These then often reinforce stereotypical narratives about communities.
Yeah, and I think there is a savior complex that's embedded in that, in terms of like you're going to feel even better about buying the product if you know that you're helping somebody through, who's overcome so much. Mission-driven products are often sold using some level of someone's trauma, and it ultimately makes you feel like you're just being valued for your traumas and nothing else.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. I really struggle with storytelling because I do feel that this emphasis on maker or artisan stories validates trauma for the individuals themselves. By focusing so much on trauma in the artisans' stories and in the stories we tell, we are subconsciously telling makers that their trauma is in some way a blessing, that because of their trauma, they now have a job. When I am shopping for ethically made products, I struggle as a woman of color. Stories of heart-wrenching hardship with photos of women that look like me are often what make people buy a product. It's like these stories make the consumer feel good about how they're spending their money. And in some ways, it reinforces the idea that even consumerism can counter the harmful inequities it also creates. You've talked about sharing your own story with trauma because that is a story you can consent to sharing. However, have you seen that consent slip away from you over the years, where you have seen people share your story in ways you wouldn't have wanted them to?
Oh my gosh, all the time. And I think that's why I'm probably extra sensitive about consent and storytelling with our artisan partners, is because how many times articles have been written about me as like, rape survivor helps other rape victims or something like that. And it's really detrimental to my mental health too. If I wake up and have a Google alert on my name that has this, certain headline or whatever. And it just feels like I have been boiled down into this singular identity, ultimately being valued just for my trauma. And yeah, like you say, like with artisans, they could potentially feel like, oh, the reason I'm able to sell this is because I went through this hardship. And I hope that's not the reality.
Yeah, it's scary to think that someone's income source can be so intertwined to their trauma.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's something I think about in my own life too, like when I'm thinking about my history, I still don't have the right words for it because I'm like, I'm definitely not grateful that happened to me. And also like, it is what led me to, a career that I'm passionate about and relationships that I very much so value and a sense of purpose and whatnot. So yeah, it's a hard thing to grapple with. And I think just generally, we need to be doing a better job of not putting people in this singular identity and valuing them as their whole person. And when we think about what that looks like with artisan partnerships, I think making sure we're not just valuing a person's ability to produce either.
I feel like we have a different understanding of privacy when it comes to people living in the global north versus global south. I do feel that colonialism has fed into society's pervasive assumption that people of color, especially those in the global south, need saving. When it comes to sexual violence, for example, this isn't just a problem in the global south. It happens everywhere, including your own neighborhood, which makes me wonder if a fair trade product was made by someone living in the global north that looked like the white majority, would people have the same emotional connection to the purchase?
Right. And would you expect them to share their story, or would you respect that it could be more private because maybe sharing that story puts them in danger in some way, or maybe it's something they don't want to keep reliving by sharing their story over and over. Maybe there would be more ultimately respect for another person's experiences if it were in your own neighborhood. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we don't expect people here to disclose that information, but yet we have this expectation almost that when it's someone abroad, that information is all of a sudden fair play.
Right. And I mean, there's a spectrum abroad, just like there's a spectrum here, like I'm a person who overshares on social media probably. And most of my best friends never post, like they could get engaged and they're not going to put it on the internet. And that's cool. Like that's their choice. In the same way, our artisan partners, sometimes they're like super pumped to share their story. And it's something they want our customers to know about. And sometimes they want us to know their traumas too, because they want to be like, these are all the things that I've overcome and like, look at me now, but, people who don't even want to say a word because they don't want anything shared, that's also cool. It should be your choice. It should be something you have agency over, your own story.
This really leads me to think about informed consent. There is a difference between saying, sure, you can tell people about my personal trauma, and knowing exactly the extent to which someone's photo and narrative will be used on swing tags and shops, on social media, on your website, and so forth. I strongly believe it's important for makers to understand what exactly they're giving consent to and what that might mean.
Yeah. That's what we've transitioned to in the last 2 years or so, has been more, not just, can we share your story? Granted, I don't think we ever asked, can we share your story? I think it was always more like, is there something you would like us to tell customers? Now it's more, are you interested in sharing part of your story with customers? Like, if so, this is going to be the process, like I would sit down for an interview. I would only use what you say in that interview. So it's not everything else I know about your life. It's what we talk about in that interview. You get to decide what you want included. I'll do a write-up. I'm going to share that write-up with you, and we can change it and edit it and do whatever you want. Ultimately, that exact write-up, should you give your consent, would be potentially shared on social media pages, seen by thousands of customers. And it's possible that, a little chunk could be used on like a hang tag, or that some of our retail partners would want to print off that story and put it on a wall. And, it could be on the internet. And so it's possible your family members could see it or other people in your community. And so, yeah, I go into this whole spiel about this is what it could mean. And I don't want you to just say yes right now. Ultimately, what I need to figure out now is if they give their full consent, knowing what things will be used for and everything, if they give that to me now in 2020, how frequently should I be updating that? How frequently should I be getting that consent again? Because I think consent is a fluid thing too, you can feel really comfortable with that at one point, but then, maybe a situation changes and it's no longer safe for your story to be shared or something. And I'm not going to know that unless I ask.
The thing is, though, we live in a really digital era. Once something is on the internet, it's there, even if you delete it. My fear, I suppose, is if circumstances do change, how do you really pull all that information back? How do you go to your retail partners, ask them to take down the stories, delete posts, change packaging, swing tags? That's a lot of work.
Yeah, I'm honestly not sure. Because you can put it out there, but ultimately once it's out there, like you say, you basically don't have control over the story anymore, which is, what can be terrifying. So I think to that extent, just getting consent as much as we possibly can and frequently and whatnot. And then, but ultimately as a brand and as consumers moving away from needing that story, I think, I don't know. I feel like as a fair trade brand, all the other fair trade brands are going to be like, what are you saying? This is part of our core competency. And it's it is, the relationships that we have, the really beautiful relationships that we have are part of what makes us unique. But it's also kind of a strange thing to capitalize on. So I don't know. Yeah. And I don't know how to change it. I'm interested in exploring it. Ultimately with my own therapist, I've been talking about how do I change this narrative? I don't want my story to be out there as much as it currently is anymore either, just because I feel like it's not great for my own mental health to have people refer to me as that, or just, as a victim, as something that I had no power over. I had no decision-making power as a part of that. And so I think it'll be interesting if I can attempt to kind of pull it back with my own story and then see, how do I expand that to our artisan partners as well. And I think ultimately, if I'm going to have retail partners and all sorts of people basically try to pull these stories back, I'm ultimately probably going to have to do it at the same time, because unfortunately, kind of to your point, it feels like people will respect my need for changing my own personal narrative more than they might respect the need to stop sharing other people's personal narratives.
So we've talked a lot about the actual written story. The other part of storytelling, which in so many ways is even more powerful, is visual storytelling or photography. I really struggle with photography in the ethical fair trade space because it does capitalize and reinforce narratives about communities. We also tend to take photos and share them without really thinking about consent or compensating the person like we would a model in the global north if we were using their photo to sell our products. The classic example I like to share is the iconic photo of the Afghan girl, a photo that was published on the cover of National Geographic in 1985. The woman who is photographed, her name is Sharbat Gula, and the story goes that she was at school, sitting in class, was pulled out of class without her consent or parental consent, as a matter of fact, by the photographer, a white male, who took her to a nondescript location, posed her and photographed her. And what that photo is most known for is the fear in her eyes, which when you read interviews people have had with her in recent years, where she talks about how that one photo derailed her life completely, while the photographer himself got global recognition. That fear in her eyes that we see is genuine fear of a stranger. It's fear of that photographer. And it truly blows my mind how we don't apply the same principles around consent in photography with those living in the global South as we do with those living in the global North. I don't think any brand would ever take photos of kids in Seattle neighborhood just post it on social media without parental consent. I don't think that would ever happen.
Yeah, and we talk about that too. We've led a few trips abroad and brought our customers to meet our wonderful artisan partners, and have had dance parties and built relationships in that way. And it's been so fun. But that's been one of the conversations ahead of time. Absolutely is like, you have to have consent before you take a picture of anyone. And, if you're walking down the street and you think it's, fine to take a picture of somebody doing something over there, I'm like, they're still in the picture. Like, you still have to get their consent. And so if you don't feel comfortable getting their consent, probably means you shouldn't be taking their picture. So just don't, and I get that you want those pictures. And it's part of what you've experienced. It's part of what you're learning about a new culture, and it's intriguing. And ultimately, I think it can make people feel, quite marginalized. Kind of like, I think like zoo animals, unfortunately, like, we just like kind of walk by and like take your picture and leave.
So my husband and I were traveling to Morocco, and my husband wears a turban, and we were in Morocco, and we were tourists, and there was another tourist who thought we were locals and started taking photos of us because my husband wears a turban, and he associated that with local culture. We literally had to go up to this person and be like, excuse me, can you please not take a photo of us? Then they kind of casually went further away and started like taking those like undescript, like, I'm not photographed. I'm taking a photo of the scene. I'm not taking a photo of you per se. This idea of consent being so important, because what we often don't realize is sometimes the photos that we take, photos tell more of a story than even written text does now, right? Like, we live in such a visual era, and just the way that we try to portray artisans, I think oftentimes subconsciously portray them as in a position of less power. And I wonder how you have navigated that as a social enterprise.
Yeah, I think some of those pictures, I don't know, there's so many different kinds of pictures. I've got a lot in my brain right now, but some of them are tricky because ultimately it's, sometimes I think it's less about the picture and more about how the viewer perceives the picture, there's the classic trope that they talk about with like voluntourism when, you have a white woman like surrounded by a bunch of children of color or something in an orphanage or whatever. Right. And like, that's a no-no as it should be.
Or like the hovering, like there's this hoveringness that happens in those photos oftentimes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes I don't know, I think about it a lot. I'm over 6 feet tall. And so the hovering is sometimes inevitable, if I'm to be in a picture. And like, I think about, all the pictures that I take with Anita, who is one of my favorite people in the entire world, where we are texting on WhatsApp. Like, I mean, I talk to her more than I talk to any of my, best friends here. And we have this really beautiful relationship, but ultimately we'll get feedback sometimes on social media, which I actually appreciate that we have the kind of customer that is activist enough that they would reach out to us as a brand and call us out and whatnot. But people that will say, you've got this picture of you and Anita, and it looks like, you're trying to save her or whatever. I'm like, that's obviously not what we want. But it can be tricky because sometimes it feels like it's the perception of the viewer too. Like, you should be able to have pictures with your close friends without the assumption of saviorism. I think that this idea of having all these pictures of the people who make your product, I think it'll likely change in the next few years. I think people want transparency around where their products are being made, how they're being made, making sure that things are done in ethical, sustainable ways. But ultimately, when we started Fair Anita, we talk about, we want design to be first, like the first thing that people are attracted to for your product. Second, like, people stick around because of the price point. The price point fits within your budget. A lot of times people convert on just design and price point without knowing the story at all. And sometimes that story is, the icing on the cake or whatever. That's the way we want it to be. And I think that's the way that this ethical brand movement is going, in terms of the customers don't necessarily need that full story anymore. I think about that a lot. I think with storytelling and sharing pictures and whatnot too, kind of to your point earlier, like, is it something that I would share about one of my best friends here on the internet? If not, why am I thinking that that's an acceptable thing for artisans?
Definitely. And I think it's all about having this healthy narrative and conversation with yourself, your team, the makers that you're working with, and being willing to go into these conversations with an open mind, knowing that we don't necessarily know the answers. And that's okay. Like, it is okay to not know the answers. And, you made a great point, is at the end of the day, oftentimes customers make the narrative that they want to hear or they want to see. And I agree. I think oftentimes we see photos and we go in with our own internal bias and how we perceive something or how we read a story. But I think that doesn't necessarily mean we should not be trying our best to help shift that narrative and shift that mindset and really engage in these tough conversations with customers, because that's a critical part of helping change the narrative. And just to that photo with you and Anita is, there's also healthy questioning that we can ask ourselves is there a different way I can position myself and Anita where we seem like we are on the same level versus I am in some way superior to her? Or is it purely, is there something around how we present ourselves or how the photo is taken or the background or something that I can do to help just change the perception of what people see? But we also have to realize at the end of the day, there is a certain level of power dynamic there. Regardless of the friendship that you hold with Anita, there is a power dynamic between you and her. And I love that you're able and willing to have that conversation and really think about what are ways that I can maybe approach the way I'm telling the story about my relationship with her differently, or even visually position things a little differently to see if we can counteract some of the emotions this image or photo might elicit.
Absolutely. And every time it happens, it's just like, it's a slap in the face that, like, this is an opportunity to improve how I'm doing this. Like, if someone is looking bad at a bottom picture of, like, me with Anita, how am I not, what am I lacking in how I'm talking about our relationship? Like, I know what this is. How do I need to change how I'm portraying this as a brand? Because ultimately there's some level of disconnect that's happening, and how do we improve that?
I do wonder, at what point does storytelling get away from us and consent becomes secondary? One of the things I struggle with is when it comes to social enterprises, as social entrepreneurs, we can't overlook the importance of treating artisan partners as humans. Creating jobs and employment opportunities doesn't mean you can do whatever you want with the photos and stories of those you work with. We can't use good intention as our get out of jail card. Good intention cannot justify overlooking basic human respect. There's a certain level of, I'm doing you a favor so I can use your story however I so wish, that needs to change. It's a mindset shift. You mentioned this a bit earlier, and I've heard this before myself, that the strength of a fair trade business is in the stories. And I think that's not necessarily true. I think the strength of a fair trade business is in transparency. Social enterprises can speak to how materials are sourced, who is making it, and all the hands that have touched a product from start to finish. And I almost feel we are doing an injustice by focusing on stories and not the supply chain transparency itself.
Absolutely. Every time that we talk to customers about, we pay 50 to 100% upfront to artisans when we are designing an order and place that order, as opposed to most retail organizations pay their suppliers, 120 days after they actually receive the product. People who actually take a second to think about that, they're like, holy cow, that makes such a huge difference. And you see that, I think it's especially interesting how that's come a little bit more to the forefront now with COVID-19 and all these brands who have refused to pay their suppliers who are already in the midst of creating these products, whereas fair trade brands, even the flow of money, and how that looks different in a fair trade brand, I think is at least I think it's intriguing and worthy of more storytelling, which doesn't involve exploiting anyone's traumas when you're talking about that too. So bonus.
As we think about where we go from here, as you mentioned earlier, consent is fluid. So having regular check-ins with artisan partners is important. Remember, no one's perfect. This is a process, and the purpose of conversations like this one is to get us thinking about how we can reflect on the systems we operate in and address some of those issues around making social enterprises more inclusive and giving each member of the business a seat at the table or an equal voice. One last thought on photography. One of the ways we can start addressing the power dynamics in photography is by making sure when we look at our marketing material that if you're producing a product in a country, say in India, for example, not every photo featuring an Indian person is that of a maker. Instead, you have Indian models using or wearing the products you sell too. All too often, I see brands only sharing photos of models who are white and placing those next to makers who are of color. This is one easy place to start when trying to change the narrative and break those barriers of power dynamics down. Diversity can't just be the artisan partners you work with. It has to be in every aspect of your business.
I'm so excited to talk about this. And I think, so often when we talk about our own social enterprise, it's about the story behind our brand. And while, of course, I like the story, I was there for it. I just really appreciate changing the conversation on that too. And let's talk about how we change storytelling and what aspects we should be including and what we shouldn't, and what's okay, what's not okay. Understanding that there is probably a spectrum for all of that. There's not always a clear-cut answer, but challenging ourselves to improve and do better, I think is the best we can do. Remembering too that that storytelling takes place not just on social media, but when we're talking to customers and building those relationships. And even if there isn't a way to be, even if it's not trackable, it's still really important in how we talk about them. If you're just selling a product to a customer and still having that conversation face to face, and the artisan can't find it on the internet or whatever, it's still necessary that we're talking about, that we're sharing those stories with consent and and in a way that makers would want to be portrayed. Yeah, I'm grateful that you've put so much thought into consent and what that looks like in fair trade brands, and that you're not afraid to challenge what that should look like going forward. Because I think the mission-driven product movement was started out of a lot of, buy this because, this woman, somewhere in Africa, like really needs water. And like, while that might be true, selling the product based on that narrative, I hope is no longer, what we're talking about. And I think as more and more larger brands too are saying, oh, this is sustainable or whatever, tag words they want to use. Some of that transparency into fair trade brands and what does the process actually look like, and all those things that give us that core competency, that competitive advantage. How do we change that conversation? And I hope this is a starting point to push this conversation further.
With that, I want to thank all the listeners for tuning into today's episode and extend a special thank you to Joy for joining me today and sharing her valuable insights. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to follow Fair Anita and shop their beautiful collection. To learn more about Art of Citizenry and for information on future webinars and workshops, please visit artofcitizenry.com. You can also find me on Instagram at Manpreet Kaura. Please remember to subscribe to Art of Citizenry podcast on your favorite listening app. From here in Seattle, sending positive and healthy vibes your way.